Salam, Sister Berak.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you very much for joining me again. I think to start off the conversation, as you've just mentioned to the people watching on Instagram Live, we wanted to address the conversation around domestic abuse and domestic violence. I think from my perspective, primarily, I thought it'd be an interesting topic to talk about. And I've actually had a few people recommend that we talk about this and address this. Is because of the fact that we're in a time where people are locked at home due to coronavirus.
Yes.
And we're finding ourselves kind of almost, and I think as the weeks go on, increasingly everyone is feeling like a bit of a caged animal. And sometimes because we don't have our gyms, we don't have our sports, we don't have like our regular, whatever activities we would do to release the tension and whatever it might be. th- I think already people are seeing that there's been a rise in, so we're recording hopefully with Muslim Youth Helpline, and they've been talking about the fact they've had a huge increase in calls.
Yes.
And so I'm going to be talking to Zora in a couple of days actually about that, and we're going to put that out. But also domestic abuse charities are saying that they've also had increased calls and everything else. So I thought it's important for people, and even for myself, because I don't know a lot about the topic, but to understand the kind of start to finish, or the A to Z of this whole subject. I know we're not going to be able to necessarily tackle the whole thing in an hour, but I thought it's worth at least the initial step. So from two perspectives. Firstly, if we can talk about what are the signs to look out for, because I think a lot of people assume that domestic abuse is domestic violence, and we always think about the physical. So, you know, if someone doesn't have a black eye or a bruise somewhere, then they must be fine, everything is good. But obviously we know that there's a lot more to it, and sometimes there's kind of a journey that happens essentially. Alongside that, I think there are some key terms that are worth appreciating and defining. So on one of our first podcasts that we did together, like probably 2 years ago, you introduced me to the term gaslighting.
Right.
And that was the first time I'd heard of it. And I think maybe for a lot of people that were listening then, maybe they hadn't come across that term before. So I thought that it would be good to kind of revisit some of that. And then finally, I don't know how we'll do all of this in an hour, but we'll try.
Yes.
Finally, I wanted to talk about not just looking at signs kind of within your own household or your own relationship and understanding and appreciating things, but then also if you are worried that a family member or a friend might be going through this, how do you support them? What are the kind of key words and phrases that you're looking out for, and everything else? So that's the outline of what I want to be able to discuss. Ambitious, I think,
Hmm.
but let's see what we can do. There's a comment here that's just saying, love the color coordination. I'm sure this wasn't planned, but it's worked out quite nice.
Yeah. It's funny. I guess subconsciously I wear colors that match the topic, and purple is the color that's used for domestic violence and domestic abuse awareness. So it just so happens to be the colors of the Muslim vibe as well. So interestingly enough.
We'll take
So
it.
yes, yeah. So definitely you've given a good outline in terms of what we want to explore, that we're going to try our best, inshallah, to get within the hour, because I am during my lunch break right now from work. But since we're fasting, there's no need for actual lunch, but food for the mind is definitely valuable for us with this topic. So definitely when we think of domestic violence or abuse, the image that we get is of a man beating his wife at home and his kids. But that's not so much the case. We know now that it's happening to both men and women, and not necessarily the physical, because we get the image of the physical. In reality, there's almost a process that leads up to the physical. It doesn't immediately happen right away, right?
Mm.
So there's different categories of abusive behavior which have their own consequences, and that could eventually lead to physical, right? And leaves so much destruction on the victims, including children who observe the violence or witness to that, right? So let's go through some of these categories, and as we go through them, we'll probably think of scenarios that we've come across of people and say, oh, I wasn't aware of this, and these also can be seen as signs for you as well. So let's look at them. So let's take a look at control. All right. And so the idea of control is controlling a behavior's way of the abuser to maintain dominance over their victim. This controlling behavior is the belief that they are justified in this behavior, and the resultant abuse is the core of domestic violence, right? It's very subtle and insidious and very pervasive. So control could be in terms of being able to see the scent or the red sign on your phone, potentially, unless it's something you agree as a couple or as a family, or you don't care. It could be, I need to see where you're going all the time. So on GPS on your phone, right? Who are you talking to? You're not allowed to go here. You're not allowed to go to the masjid. You're not allowed to go to your parents' house, right? This in turn, what does this control do? It isolates the victim. And the controller, the abuser, is very much aware of what they're doing in terms of trying to keep that person isolated from speaking or connecting with other people. Sometimes it's in the form of, I love you. I don't want anybody else to see you. You're mine. So it can be seen like that at the beginning, right? It can be used under the idea of love, but essentially it is how we get to the other forms of abuse. What are your thoughts on that when you hear that?
So I'm thinking out loud here. Like the reason I wanted to have this conversation is for me to kind of hear the whole thing in one and be able to kind of reconcile bits. Because I like, based on what you said with regards to knowing where somebody is or whatever it might be, I've seen that manifested in many different relationships in many different ways. So sometimes it can be a case of protection. Like, I want to make sure that you're protected at all times. I need to know where you are. Other times it can be suspicion, obviously based on, oh, you have XYZ friends I don't like or whatever.
Right.
But I'm also just thinking that I feel like people don't set out in relationships to be abusive, if you know what I mean.
No, they don't necessarily, but this behavior can be triggered or depending on the personality of the other person as well.
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes.
So sorry to cut you off, but you mentioned that it's kind of like a journey, right? So
yes.
Is it a process of things evolving? And as you said, like initially it can become, I want to know where you are so that you're safe. Then it's, I want to know where you are to control you. And then it just escalates. And then a line is crossed and then physical abuse happens. Is that how it?
There's no linear way. Yeah. There's no linear way how it progresses, but it's up and down, and it could be seen and manifested through these. So we talked about control. We also looked at isolation, right, as a form of abuse, which again is related to the control. So it's not an isolated behavior, because this is the outcome of many kinds of abuse that you see. So by keeping the victim from seeing who they want to see, doing what they want to do, setting and meeting their goals, this is how controlling the victim thinks and feels. So the perpetrator is isolating the victim from the resources, whether it's personal or public, which may help them leave the relationship as well. So again, this is not linear. It doesn't just all of a sudden happen and say, all right, so I am now isolating you. You see that happening in their actions over time, right?
Yeah.
There's also the emotional abuse, right? Which is any behavior that exploits another's vulnerability, insecurity, or character. And these behaviors include continuous degradation of the person, intimidation, manipulation, brainwashing, or control of another person to be detriment of the individual. So you see right there, this is common: verbal, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, right? It's around there. Now let's go further, okay, with verbal abuse, coercion, threats, blame, okay? So verbal abuse is any abuse language to denigrate, embarrass, or threaten the victim. Okay, so this is also part of it right there. Now this can also lead, or it could be all part of the financial abuse. So let's say, a couple gets into an argument, or just it's happening in the family. It could be siblings too, by the way, right? And what happens there is the victim is now in a position like this, right, where they constantly have to try and please their abuser. So the manipulator, the abuser could say, what would really make me happy is if I have access to your accounts, your salary, your money. Oh, as a couple, maybe, especially in the Muslim household where women are not shar'an required to give their money or salary over. It's mustahab to help the family, but it's her money, right? And we see this a lot within our communities where it's good for you to share your money. It's good that, we put it towards the mortgage or the bills of the house, et cetera, et cetera. And I know a lot of couples do this, and bless them. It doesn't mean you're in an abusive relationship, but you see the dynamic here, right? Where he would call her all sorts of names, And or she would be, you're not sharing, you're not giving me, I want that Prada, you know, purse and the shoes, just like, what's her name, you know, like, you see how it works both ways. We mostly hear it in the form of male versus females, right? So she then agrees to this as a way of pleasing her partner. He has control now over her finances. He chooses where the money goes. If she dares say anything, then she doesn't respect her husband, she's not helping the family, etc., etc. So you see how now the manipulation occurs, right? With the verbal.
Yeah.
Now, there's also religious abuse. And this is a very delicate one, which I explored with Sheikh Fayez Jaffer a few weeks ago. And it's important for our viewers, please look at that video as well, because in that, through the Nasimco website and YouTube channel, we also included in there an audio of a woman who described her experience of abuse. And she herself talked about, didn't start off with the physical, and she went through the different stages, right? So I encourage people after they're done this to check it out.
So that we'll put the link in the description, and I'm glad as well you made me listen to that audio clip before we had this conversation, and the sister kind of details her story, and the various different forms of abuse, which I think was almost a bit fascinating. I mean, heartbreaking, obviously, to imagine that someone's had to live through that, but it's incredible to see the kind of progression in the different forms. So the example of her story with regards to religious abuse, there was, her husband was basically saying that, oh, you know, you're praying all this extra salah, but you can't even like do your basics of like the cooking and cleaning to look after the house. At the same time, he was abusing her financially, from the perspective of when she stopped working. I think he was saying that, you know, you don't contribute to the house or whatever, all your your job is basically to cook and clean and to look after the house. This is now your responsibility, that's it. And belittling her and isolating her in that way. And it's quite amazing to see how it kind of evolves, and I guess snowballs, and then ultimately in her case in particular, it resulted in physical, you know, physically being abused and beaten. And you mentioned kind of control, and an interesting thing that her husband said to her in her particular case was, he said that when they're having arguments and things are heated, he says, control yourself before I control you, or before I have to control you.
Coercion, intimidation, right there.
And there's this like weird dynamic at play. Can I ask, from your kind of more clinical side, although this whole conversation is about that, but how and why, like, what's the root cause of people becoming abusive? I know it's a very broad question.
It is, and there's a few factors, and it's an excellent question we need to understand, because sometimes there's a cycle to begin with, that the abuser could have been abused themselves, whether sexually, physically, emotionally. They probably grew up in a household where this was emulated and modeled in front of them as the norm, right? So then they continue what they were brought up with in that cycle. It could be that they were bullied. It could be that they have low self-esteem, so they need to feel good about themselves by dominating and hurting another person. And, you know, this is a sick personality that is quite out there, not just in an abusive household, so to speak, but people who thrive on that kind of power, right? And it's a very borderline behavior, as well as a narcissistic behavior. They get their jollies, so to speak, by dominating and hurting other people. When they know they've hurt other people, they themselves feel good about themselves. So it's a very strange dynamic, and it's sick. It truly is. And so this is where you see that in the household, potentially. And it could be because of these factors. So there's not one specific factor. And Lisa Vogel, who's spoken with you, and I've also spoken with her publicly about domestic violence. And I'll use her example, where she said that her partner was somebody who was outwardly very religious in the community, was the first one to read the Quran or the dua or offer to do anything publicly in front of everybody. Like, mashallah, brother, mashallah. This mashallah brother, look what he did at home. So sometimes the abuser can portray themselves out there in the community, to the world, in their workplace, as charming, as religious, as kind, helpful, helping other people, when in fact at home, don't let me swear publicly, he's this
So
type of character towards their family.
I was going to
By
say,
the way, females too, by the way, not just males.
I'm glad you're making that clarification as well constantly. I think it's important to appreciate that abuse obviously does go both ways, but I think at the same time the large majority of cases are still male, men essentially abusing their wives or significant others. So we've had a few questions, and I think I'm going to start with the most recent one that's just come in because it actually links to Lisa and the conversation that I had with her. So she was on the TMV podcast, it must have been about 2 years ago now. And she was talking about the phenomenal success she's had with Verona Collection. But then also she was talking about domestic abuse and her story, because at the time she had just started talking about it publicly and was kind of helping people. And the question that I asked her is similar to what we've just had come in. So someone asks here in the questions, what's the reason for, in the comments, sorry, what's the reason for people sticking in relationships when they've seen signs of abuse? So similar to what I asked Lisa, and I learned quite an important lesson that day. I asked her, I was like, well, you knew this was going on. Why didn't you tell someone? Why didn't you leave? And it's the same question I think that everybody asks people who have been in abusive relationships for a long time. And I think if I can at least jump in from one side and then you can correct anything that I say. But I think often what happens is that you still love this person. This is the person you fell in love with. It's the person you spent years with, often have a child with.
Yes.
You're emotionally invested in them. And so when you see wrong, and it's like anyone, when you see wrong in your friends and your family, you're willing to overlook certain things because they're still a good friend. They still treat you right in other ways. And I think when it comes to abuse, because it's a journey, and as you said, it's not linear, but there are many different iterations of how things are played out. But it becomes one of those things where, like, you're willing to forgive. Oh, he accidentally did this, or she accidentally did that.
That's how it builds up. Exactly. That's how it builds up.
And then you just become habituated. And also there's an element of shame. And I've had, like, we've had a lot of people send in, content to the Muslim Vibe in terms of articles. And one person was talking about a slightly different issue, but they didn't want to expose their spouse's wrongs because they didn't want to bring shame to them as well. Right. And it's like, and there's almost like that, not self-blaming, but like you don't want to be the cause of them being publicly seen as negative in people's eyes and everything else. So I think there's a lot of reasons from what I've heard in kind of exploring this space. Is there anything that I've missed out in answer to that question?
I believe you've covered most of it. Yeah. The sense of that you do love this person, that they love you. This is how they show their love, right? The sense of shame of possibly breaking up a family, right? Because essentially that's what's going to happen if this woman leaves, that you will break the family. How is this going to impact the children financially? One of the biggest reasons why women stay in these relationships is because of finances. I'll give you a story. A few years ago, a woman in Toronto from a Somali family, it was public, had 4 kids. She ran away from the abusive partner. The community did not support. She wasn't able to get emotional support or whatnot from the community, but also financially, she wasn't able to take care of her family. She came back to him. Soon after, we heard that he had killed her and the children. It can lead to this kind of extremes. And that's why it is so important that even though financially that can be a factor for people staying or even coming back to the relationship, we need to, as a community, support, but also support them financially so they don't feel that they have to go back there, because this is what happened. And this is not an isolated incident. This happens outside of our community as well. It's happening everywhere. So let me rephrase that. This is not a Muslim issue. This is everywhere. But in our communities, we're not talking about this as much as we should. We have in the last few years, alhamdulillah, through different mediums, especially when we've been talking about mental health. This one is coming out as well because of how it's impacting people. So love, shame, finances, right? And of course, the lack of support that we get. And I have to put the disclaimer out there that has been changing, but we know the rhetoric is what, when let's say a woman goes to a sheikh, a scholar, or a community head, what is it that we hear? Be patient. Be patient. Or even family members, be patient. Is this the time to be patient when he has laid his hand on her and the children, when he has gaslighted the manipulated, projected his sickness and illness onto her, verbally abused her, sexually abused her, financially abused her, using religion as a way to abuse her, like you described earlier. You know, your prayers are not accepted by God because you don't listen to me, you don't take care of me. Yeah. Meanwhile, she's working day and night to please this person, and he's not appreciating because nothing is good enough. It's about that control. So we've covered most of these, right? And it becomes really hard too. Sometimes people are quite surprised, right? That they put, first of all, somebody mentioning they always put the blame on the woman. You did this. You didn't do better. You didn't do this, that, right? So we need to change that mentality. But what's really fascinating is that, and I lost my train of thought. It was right there and it left when I saw that comment.
This is the problem with Instagram lives. Comments come in.
No, that's great though. We want to keep the conversation because that's an excellent point. The woman feels that sure enough that she could try to do better to change him. That's not what I wanted to talk about though. It'll come back. Do you remember what I was saying right up until that point?
I got lost in the comment as well, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I think people are now apologizing for commenting. Guys,
please no, keep going. Keep coming.
I'm writing down questions that are coming in. I think let's also, there's one question that's come in, which I'm just gonna ping on here. I think, can you see that on your screen as well?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think this is really interesting. And I know I'm pretty sure we've discussed this in the past. And it was with regards to family, because it's one thing if you're in an abusive relationship, you can walk away. But when it's your parents, when it's your siblings, it's a lot more difficult to just be able to step away from that, to sever ties, right? How can people deal with this? And I think also, I mean, whilst you're 100% right that the constant answer of be patient is not sufficient, I feel like it is also important that people at some point do actually start with patience, with trying the simple stuff of like mention to the person, depending on what the relationship is. If it's your parents, if it's your mom or your dad who's criticizing XYZ, who's making you feel like this, try and have that conversation. I think that's where it always starts. But then,
and we're not saying to divorce or leave right away. There are steps to do, but however, if there is violence involved right away, and this is between a husband and a wife, I'll get to the parents in a second. That needs to be nipped in the bud immediately, because that's just going to grow. That's not going to change.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that there are people who have realized their mistakes, alhamdulillah, and they've worked on themselves and they have changed. We've heard of beautiful stories like that too. They've made a mistake in raising their hands or being abusive in other ways, and they've rectified themselves, alhamdulillah. They've been guided. But for the most part, if the partner does not nip it in the bud right away, it's going to grow. And that's something Lisa and I spoke about a lot. When it comes to the family dynamics with parents, this is difficult. And I've seen this a lot with clients, and people in the community come with this a lot. It's very tricky from a Muslim perspective as well, because you are supposed to respect and take whatever your parents take you. Discussing this with scholars in depth, the results also came out from these discussions that when it becomes physically abusive and hurtful, that's not accepted, of course. There's no place in that in our faith. This is where you need to get an intervention, where you get other people involved to come and speak with the family, right? Setting your boundaries. Sometimes it's really hard to get away from the situation, right? Again, we don't encourage people to leave the household, but if it gets to the point where there's that constant abuse and physical, and it could come from a brother, it could come from a sibling, it could come from another family member, not just parents, right? And I'm dealing with these cases all of the time, whether it's my own work at the university or off campus within the community. It could be a sibling, it could be somebody else. This is common as well. The person needs to get away, especially when you're living in this part of the world where there are shelters, there are community supports, there are help. If the intervention of the community is not helping, or another elder or another person that you trust to talk to hasn't helped in preventing the abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, verbal, like they said, this person needs to leave, because this is a cycle that it's going to continue. And it could get to the point where their lives could be lost. We hear this in honor killings. We hear this, in izzat. We hear this within our communities where people accuse other people of wrongdoings that hasn't occurred, but because they have a mentality of protection and protecting the family honor, or protecting what they need to as a family, none of what's happening inside has to go outside because it's so shameful, right?
It's interesting.
They lead to this type of violence and abuse. Yeah.
I was going to say, everything you're saying, for me at least, is about narratives that we create in our own heads. So there's an interesting question here about asking if people ignore signs
I
of
see
these
that.
issues during the engagement period out of love. And I
Yes.
think I definitely believe that's the case. And a lot of it is about exactly that, right? Like we create this narrative that this person at that point in our lives is perfect. They can do no wrong. And when there's like something where they might say something that's hurtful or do something wrong or whatever, we kind of think, oh no, I'm just being sensitive, or I don't need to react, or oh, they'll change, it's just a one-off thing. And I
Yes.
think, like you said, it's so important, especially, and for those people who are single and who are looking to get married, inshallah, you're able to find someone quickly and someone that's right for you. But I think at that time, it's really important to be so authentically yourself and ensure that whoever you're speaking to is also authentically themselves, and not to rush into kind of marriage or into a relationship without having your eyes open. And I feel like also because within our communities, a lot of the time, it's going to be like the first time you've really kind of spoken to someone from the opposite sex, and
Yeah.
it's very exciting, and it's kind of there's loads of just hormones essentially flying around,
It
and
is. Yeah.
and as a result your judgment is clouded, and
Yes.
then 2 years later, I think when the honeymoon period is fully kind of done and you're in the trenches of life, that's when you realize who the other person sleeping on the other side of the bed is. And so it's so important to be able to go in with your eyes open. But then, as I said, like you mentioned, I think when stuff comes up, you can't suppress it. You have to kind of be able to address it straight away, have the conversation. If it means going to a therapist or a counselor, a couples counselor, do that. But you need to resolve your issues, because it just snowballs, and resentment, I guess, can ultimately build. I apologize. I feel like I'm doing your job right now.
You're
Um,
doing a great job. You're not. You're
I'm
doing
meant
a
to be
wonderful job.
facilitating, but we've had these conversations so many times, and like I've been involved. My wife's actually currently doing a counseling course herself,
Bless
so it's
her.
really interesting. Like I'm seeing and I'm learning loads from different sides.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, there's more questions, but if you have any thoughts, feel free to jump in while I go through them.
Yeah. So what you're describing is exactly the case of what's happening, right? So people are caught up in the romance, the lust, the falling in love stage, which is normal, that you ignore these signs or you don't see them. Mind you, there are people who know somebody for such a long time, and after they move in with them, then the reality of socks and dirty dishes and all that comes along. But then other stuff start happening. Sometimes the manipulator is so good at what they're doing, even the smartest person can be fooled by them.
Can we talk
So
about gaslighting here? Sorry to cut
so
you off.
no, that's exactly what we're getting into, right?
Okay.
So what is gaslighting essentially, right? The definition is that you manipulate somebody by psychological means into questioning their own reality, making you feel that you are the one who is crazy, that you are the one who is wrong. So when you are in that position, you are then going to be constantly wanting to please that person, to get their approval, and questioning your sanity. Like, did I really say that? Did I really think that? Did I really express that out loud? So again, it's a very manipulative form of control that the person has. And they also, what they tend to do in the gaslighting is they project their behavior, their faults, their lack of self-esteem onto you, right? And so then you start feeling like, yeah, I am selfish. Oh, I should have done this for them. Oh, wow, they're so right about that. I am such a ABC. Do you see how that works?
Yep.
It's sick. It's absolutely sick that people do that. And they get that sense of surge of power when they see you in that weak position. And it just gives them more and more power.
Someone's just asked for an example of gaslighting. Can you think of anything or anything that you've had to deal with your
Okay.
patients, clients?
So somebody, they're arguing or fighting, and this person did not actually say something. Okay. So this person then will say, you said this. You actually said this. There could be other people on and say, did they not just say that? They said that. They said that. But in fact, this person didn't. It was the other person. Now, I know we argue and have fights with our partners all the time, and normal, healthy argument is good. And it's also important to make up and other people see that. I'm not talking about the normal cases here. I'm talking about some incidences where you actually said that. And you're like, but no, this was, I didn't actually say that. And 100% you did not say that. But they continue to persist to convince you that. On top of it, they will tell you, you're insane. Like they could actually say that there's something wrong with you. Did you forget about that you actually said and did this incident? And so you end up almost believing that you didn't say this when, like, that you said this when you didn't. So this is a very simple example, but then this can continue.
I guess this is also part of like being isolated. So for example, if it's someone who doesn't necessarily get out of the house, doesn't have many friends, has limited interaction, and then within that kind of construct, their partner is able to manipulate and mold them in this way that you're kind of saying, right? It's I didn't realize there was so much kind of complexity in this space, and only when we, I think, had the first few conversations on the podcast, must be like almost 2-3 years ago,
yes.
My eyes were open to just how the fact that people can be so manipulative, that there are like specific terms for different types of manipulations in relationships, just goes to show like how crazy this kind of space and spectrum is. Moving the conversation on slightly to, I guess, how to approach and deal with people who you suspect might be in abusive relationships, be it friends, family, whatever. What are the signs to look out for? Because I think this is ultimately it. Because I know, for example, when people in the community, or just people that people have known, have committed suicide or have done something quite extreme with their lives, whatever it might be, often people will come forward and say, oh, like, I wish I knew, I wish he said something, I wish she said something, I wish there was a sign. And often there are signs, but we're just not trained to look out for them. So specifically with domestic abuse, or just abuse generally within relationships and everything else, what are we looking out for?
So there's a number of things to look at. I'm just pulling up a great resource I have online from Ottawa to go through it so I don't miss anything. And of course I can't find it right now. Oh, here it is. So this is a great resource. It's called the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women, also known as OCTIVA. And so what they do is they provide these resources for women to look out for, and just anybody who's dealing with it, in terms of what to look out for. I'm just going to quickly pull it up. If not, I can just tell you what I know in my mind. So how to get help and what to look out for. So the idea is, again, to look at somebody who, to be aware of somebody who perhaps is feeling they look very fearful, right? Right now, I know in the pandemic right now, it's really hard because we know there's an increase of that. But somebody who looks very fearful, very nervous all the time, not as happy, as engaged as they used to be, right? Always coming up with excuses for not joining, let's say, activities at work, activities with friends, family, as well as at the masjid or whatever center or groups and activities you're involved with. So somebody who's constantly withdrawn like that, right? Somebody who is not as engaged as they used to be, and always coming up with excuses. So these types of things, right? You see this person they look 10, 20 years older than their actual age, right? The young people perhaps, or even older, that they look even more tired and older. I remember somebody a few years ago who did not look herself at all. She looked 15 years older herself. The minute she got away from that situation, she didn't tell people what was going on, but you know what they kept telling her? You are shining. You look beautiful. You are glowing. SubhanAllah, how when you get away from such a situation, how it internally, it changes you. And this person looked younger than they looked before. So these are some of the signs that I found that are pretty common. And these are, I think my earphones are about to die, so I've got my wired ones just in case.
That's fine.
Yeah. So these are some of the signs that we see, right? Somebody who's constantly isolated, right? Of course, visible signs are things that you're going to see, such as bruises on them as well, and they're going to come up with excuses about them. Right? I think it's more not necessarily the physical, because people have a way of hiding the physical with good makeup and things like that. But also if you're out with the couple or the family and you can see the dynamics, the control, you can see the looks, you can see how somebody's withdrawn while the other person is alight and all that. Sometimes they even show themselves to be okay, but they're really not, right? So these are some signs to look out for.
And what do you do? Because I mean, you mentioned the horrible case of the family in Canada that were killed by the husband after having returned to them. Like that's obviously an extreme and probably, you know, the worst potentially possible outcome. But what action should you take at that point where you see something potentially wrong? Because often I know if you approach the individual, they might just deny it. They might be like,
They
oh
will
no,
deny it.
they will
They
deny
will
it. But
deny it because they're so in fear of actually accepting their circumstances. I recall a story of a friend who confronted a friend of hers, okay, and said, why are you letting him manipulate you like that? Why are you letting him talk to you like that? She cut her friend off because she was terrified at that time to face the reality of it. It took years later where she turned back to her friend and said, you were right, but she did not have the courage at the time to do what she needed to first to admit it, because it's hard to admit. Sometimes you're not even aware you're in an abusive situation, by the way, because it's the norm for you, unfortunately, right? So when you do talk about, just quickly, I just remembered one of the signs also to look for is somebody who is always sick, not going to work, not going to class, not attending, not coming to family, always an excuse not to come. They're always sick. That could be potentially part of it as well, unless they truly are dealing with an illness, right? So that's something to be aware of as well.
So there's a lot to take
I
in.
know there's a lot to take in
realize,
here.
I realized that we were trying to do a lot within a short space of time, but I think, and the comments are quite
Yeah, I'm looking at them right now.
it's quite telling that people are so kind of invested in this topic, because I feel like it's something that we all need to kind of be aware of. It's similar, to be honest, the way I see it is like, if you think about things like, you know, first aid training, something that we should all have. I feel like this on the kind of mental health side is also really important. So like if somebody has like a mental breakdown or whatever, how do you approach them? How do you support people? If someone is stressed, how do you support them? And similarly, if someone's kind of in an abusive relationship, number one, how do you identify it? And then how do you help and support? I think is really important for people to be aware of. But I think as we're having this conversation, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed with just how much information there is and how
Let's
much
take
there
a
is to
little
kind of...
breather. Let's take an actual breather. So breathe in. Hold your breath. Focus on the breathing and focus how when the air gets in your lung, and breathe it out, because it is a lot. So let's take it down a notch.
Okay.
We've spoken about the different types of abuse. We've explored the different types of abuse with different examples. We've looked at actual real life scenarios that have occurred, people we know and people that we don't know that we hear about. People have been sharing great comments, support, as well as great questions, which begs the question that we probably need to do another one on this,
Yeah,
especially because people are asking. It just shows you how, and I see people, shout out to those people who I know personally who are dealing with this, and I see them here and they're being supportive. Bless you all. Kisses and hugs to you guys. This is how you show support, is by being there. Sometimes the person is not ready to hear. Sometimes you need a few of you to go and talk to this person. Habibti, my darling, my friend, your wife is abusing you. Your partner, your husband is abusing you. Your child is abusing you. Your parent is abusing you. It's really hard to take that in, but we love you and we support you and we're here to help you. That can be a starter. And I've seen that done a few times. And it's very shocking at first for that person because they themselves weren't even aware, perhaps, that they were in such a situation. So sometimes the person who is not aware, it'll take them time to wake up to that, right? Just like the examples that I gave you. Sometimes this person is dying and crying out for this help, and that's what they needed. But it's so scary to pick up and leave. It's not that simple. We talked about why. There could be the element of love still there. No matter what, this is the father of your children. This is somebody you fell in love with. You've developed a life together. You have financial ties and responsibilities together. You have the house, whatever. There's those. There's also the shame of the community. What are people going to think? Right? There's also what we have in our religion as the least accepted halal, which is divorce, right? There's so much around that, but it's there for a reason. Yes, you try. Yes, you be patient at times. But then when all else has not worked, it's time to think of a safety plan. And that website that I just talked about here, let me bring it up again. This is the one that we use here, but there's all sorts of resources worldwide. So people can look at that. It's the OCTEVAW. So Octua, you just put that in and you will find, and it will tell you step by step what to do to get out of such a situation. So for those who are listening, I will describe what you need to do step by step to leave such a situation. First and foremost, be smart. We need to be able right now to put the emotions aside. The hysterics and the emotions, I know this is hard, but this is where this needs to be put in a box on the shelf for now. This is how we deal with a traumatic incident that comes into our life. People automatically go into this mode, by the way, right? Whether you're a refugee, whether you're dealing in war, most people tend to put that aside because they're in survival mode. You're in survival mode now. Emotions we're going to try to put aside. You're going to try and get support if you can by texting or calling, making sure there's no record of the abuser seeing that you are trying to get support. Okay? Next, where are you going to go? Is there somebody that you can go to? Is there a shelter? Look for local shelters. Trust a family or friend that you can trust that can help you, whether it's through money or to help you go to them safely. Police do need to get involved at this point. When you leave with important documents such as passports, any documents that you can prove. If there's any evidence that you can collect before you decide to leave, you need to collect evidence. Document, if it means taking pictures, videos, recordings, have evidence of the abuse. Because most times we hear it's his word against her word. So you need to have evidence. This also includes with the abuser and the manipulator will have a lot of control over documents and everything that you need, whether it's the house, the mortgage, or anything, assets or anything like that. Try as much as you can to do that. What people have done in the past is they take pictures, send them, and delete them off their phone, and their friend or their family has that. So these are the things that some people do in the process. Then you have your safety plan of how you're going to leave. You keep it minimal in terms of how many people know about this. You try to keep up pretenses with the person, meaning not to provoke them, not to get into fights. Try as much as you can to keep the situation calm so that you can leave safely. If on your phone you have your GPS, you turn it off immediately after you leave. Do not answer their calls. And this is where your family or friends or whoever's involved in the safety plan call the police immediately, because this person will call the police accusing you of kidnapping their child, especially when they realize that you've taken the passports and identifications. This is a safety plan that I've worked with clients, myself, and people in the community. There's different ways of doing it, but you get the essentials. Making sure you have evidence, make sure you have your documents, make sure you have a plan of where you're going to go, make sure there's no trail behind you to be followed, and the police involved, a shelter involved, the authorities involved for your safety. And the safety for other people as well, because this person could potentially follow you somewhere or assume you were at this location where they can easily go and find you. This is where the police needs to get involved, potentially to press charges and also a restraining order. And I know this is so hard. This is when we're dealing with extreme cases here of violence and abuse, right? If we're dealing in situations of mental and psychological and whatnot, you can still leave and put the protective measures in place, but there is the safety aspect of your life when there's already physical abuse involved, or let's say this person could eventually get to that state.
So I just want to address a few things. So people are asking about access to this list that we've set out or that you've set out. Firstly, obviously, this podcast is going to be published. People can listen back to it then in their own time. We'll also publish the Instagram live, so you can watch it back on Instagram. Alongside that, we'll have a write-up on our website, and I'll make sure that we include specifically this bit. And we might even, because I think everything you just outlined was quite an important blueprint for people that might find themselves in this situation or might know somebody that is in that situation. And as I said, like, I think that alongside things like CPR, first aid, it's so important to know what to do in a situation like this, because you never know when this might occur, right? And to who and how and whatever. There were a couple of questions that have come up, I think, whilst you were talking.
Yes.
One of them I think is quite straightforward, and it was asking about when starting a relationship, getting to know someone in the engagement period, for example, how open to be. If I can offer my own kind of answer to that, I would say you have to be as open as you're. I mean, look, essentially, and someone put it to me very nicely, said that marriage is like a mirror being held up to you 24/7. So, normally you leave your house, you go out into the world, and you're kind of like this nice, jolly person with everyone. And then you come home and you're grumpy and you shout at your parents and you're sat in front of the TV and you slouch and whatever.
Yeah.
Yet when you get married, you think, and especially in the engagement period, a lot of, or like in the courting period, let's say, a lot of people are able to put up that jolly face with people. And then it's only when you move in together, suddenly you come home and you want to be grumpy and you want to sit in front of the TV and not talk and be rude, but you realize that I've just been lying to this person for so long, telling them I'm this fun person outside. And I think that's where a lot of times, relationships start to crack. And so that's where personally I would advise and say that you have to be yourself from day one when you're getting to know someone. Nobody is perfect. As much as you might think your imperfections are horrendous, like everybody has their imperfections, and it's a perfect relationship is about two imperfect people coming together and fitting together well. If that makes sense.
Yes.
The second question, which I wanted to maybe put at you, is about the community. And I think this is really important because we're having the conversation.
Before we get to that, may I just add?
Sorry, please.
Now, if your partner has, during the engagement period, has been married before or has been involved in another relationship, see if you can actually talk to the ex-partner. Find out, because if it was an amicable breakup and there's nothing to be concerned about, just differences or whatever, then that's fine. Also, look in your partner to see what they say in terms of what responsibility did they have in the breakup of this relationship. If somebody honestly talks about their role and their responsibility, what they did, rather than constantly blaming the other person, you've got somebody who's potentially being open, right? But then they could also be very good as part of the manipulation. But I think this is something that needs to be addressed during the engagement period or getting to know period, is what role did you play in the breakup of this relationship? And if you see that they're constantly blaming the other person and talking about how evil and wicked and the other person is, that's a sign right there. So yes, as part of the community, your question, brother?
Yeah. So the community, so someone asked it above, was about how how the community progresses in this light of addressing abuse. Because very early on, you spoke about the fact that when we're going to sheikhs with problems, especially women, they're told to be patient. Just be patient with him. Oh, I'm sure he didn't mean it. And I know as well people in my own life firsthand who have had this experience and have struggled to get a divorce because because the sheikh is constantly just making excuses for an abusive husband. And again, that's me not wanting to swear on an Instagram live, but a horrible kind of human being.
Yes.
And there still is, I think, a lot of work to be done, but at the same time, I think a lot of positive work is being done. So Lisa, for example, using her platform as this huge kind of fashion designer, producer, I'm not sure of her official role, but she has Verona collection that she's the director of, I believe.
Very hard to get to.
Has worked very hard, and she's now also kind of taken the risk, and I think it is a risk because people don't like the murkiness of talking about domestic abuse and whatever else, but she's using her platform to highlight that and her own story and really be able to kind of help people. And I think the more that these conversations are taking place, and this is a prime example, just seeing the kind of the comments and the questions that are coming in, it's clearly a topic and a conversation that isn't being had enough in our community. So there's a lot more that needs to be done, but what do you think can be done? How can we get there?
All right, so my lunch hour is up, so I'm going to wrap up with this last comment. That's okay. We'll finish up, and inshallah, we can discuss this more another time. Because when we start talking, when you and I start talking, we just keep going with these discussions because there's just so much in it. It's vital that our community, just like we started talking about mental health the last few years and being open to that this is one of the biggest topics, because the sheikhs are bombarded with this. You talk to any sheikh in a community, he will tell you he's the frontline worker and a family mediator, because he's the first person that people go to. right? The people in these positions, and alimas as well. So
Mm.
there needs to be an open discussion with mental health professionals, social workers, the authorities. And I know there's a distrust of that, right? Because we also have to be careful that if there are children under the age of 16 involved in a domestic abuse situation, the authorities of the city, of the county, or the country really, they can take the children away, and people are terrified of that, right? So there needs to be an awareness of working together, okay? The community heads need to make it safe for women and men, mostly for women, because that's what the statistics are, to come to them and be able to trust them to help them. If they're not going to put a stop to this person and their behavior, they need to support them and make it safe for people to come, right? And having these discussions is part of that. And we need more people within our community, when they come to you for help, to not push them away or judge them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is haqq. This is standing up against injustice. Are we all just lip service in our community, huh? Are we just talking about Imam Hussain, Fatima al-Zahra, and Lady Zainab, and the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Is this just lip service when we talk about their lives? Or are we truly embodying what they stood for in terms of standing up against injustice, huh? And standing up for the vulnerable? So when we're talking about the community, let's reflect on that and stop being hypocrites, telling an abused woman to be patient when she is being beaten down in her children. Allahu Akbar. You are not worthy of wearing that imama. You are not worthy of standing and having that position in your center when you know what's happening in that household and you are not standing up against that injustice. So it comes down to our own moral reflections here. How do you choose to stand up against this? This is an issue that is happening worldwide. It is happening in our community as well, and we need to change the narrative. And women and men who are experiencing abuse have to feel safe coming to get. It's not me telling you now, go get help. That's not how it works. It is not how it works. We are responsible to make the victims feel safe to come to us to get support. Otherwise, we will have another story and another, like that Somali mother who went back to her husband because of the lack of community support, and she got murdered, her and her children. What is the conscience on that community? And on that note, I leave it at that. It's harsh, but sometimes we need to have this harsh reality when we talk about this subject to save more lives.
Thank you very much for your time, and I know you've got to go back to work. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience as well really appreciate you taking the time out. I'm going to let you go, and I'll just wrap up with everyone, if that's all right, just so you can get back to it. But thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Really
Inshallah, we'll
appreciate
speak
it.
more about this.
So unfortunately, that's the end of our time with Sister Berak. I know there's been a lot that a lot of people have been commenting, and we haven't been able to kind of address everything. Someone was asking for Sister Berak's contact details. If anyone would like to get in touch with her or has anything else on this topic, because I appreciate it's a very sensitive topic. We can't just leave things hanging as such. If you would like to message us, if there's anything that we can do to help and support and point you in the right direction, please do that. Please message us on Instagram. And if you need to speak to Sister Berak, we can do that. And that, I think, is about it for today. Thank you guys very much for being a part of the conversation and for your comments as well. I think it's really interesting to see the response, and I like doing or having these conversations live because we see how much there is in terms of response from you guys and everything that you're going through, and what I guess topics resonate with the audience is really important. Just in terms of looking forward, so as mentioned, this is going to be out as a podcast this weekend, in fact, which I know is Eid weekend, maybe not the right kind of conversation topic, but it is what it is, really. We're going to be releasing this on Sunday, inshallah. We are also planning to do a quiz next Friday, I believe, which is going to be live on YouTube and I think Instagram as well. We have some cash prizes or some voucher prizes that how much, about £300 worth of vouchers that we're going to be giving away to various different outlets. We're going to start promoting that very soon, so do look out for that. In terms of next podcast or next conversation with Berak, I'm not sure. It's probably going to be soon, but do subscribe, follow us on Instagram if you haven't already. and we'll keep you updated going forward. If you have any suggestions, do send them through. We're always checking our messages and our emails and everything else. And we rely ultimately, we want to be able to create content for you guys and have the conversations that aren't being had elsewhere, or that need to be had, I think, on kind of this scale and platform. So I think with that, we'll probably end. Thank you guys very much for being here, and we will be back soon, inshallah. Take care. Salam.